I nearly didn't make it in surgery, but my folks were too caught up celebrating my sister's graduation to even notice. Now, I'm done acting like I can't see where their true loyalty lies. The day I almost passed away was when it finally hit me that I was just an afterthought to my parents. It's weird, lying in a hospital bed with tubes winding into your veins, feeling both weightless and heavy at the same time, and realizing you're truly alone. Not in some deep cosmic way, but literally by yourself. The harsh overhead lights made the room seem like a stage set for a solo performance that no one bothered to watch. There was no crowd. My mom wasn't there to hold my hand, and my dad wasn't pacing the halls. The only noise around me was the steady, mechanical beeping of the machines, breaking the silence like clock ticks counting down to something unavoidable. I should have been scared, I guess. After all, it was the kind of surgery you don't always come out of. But instead, a cold detachment settled over me, a hollow feeling where even fear couldn't take hold. I thought about my parents, as I often did when I had too much time to think, which was always since they were busy celebrating my sister's graduation. Not my blood sister, mind you, but my adopted sister, who seemed perfect in every way. At least, she was perfect in the way my parents liked, poised, accomplished, always playing the role they had scripted for her in their tightly controlled lives. I guess I should start by telling you about her. She was everything I wasn't. While I was bookish and introverted, she was vibrant and endlessly social. My parents adored that about her. The way she lit up a room, how she could charm anyone with just a smile. Me? I was more of a shadow, happy to stay in the background. They adopted her when I was 12. I thought I wanted a sister, or so I believed. But soon, I realized I was giving up more than I was gaining. Over time, she became the daughter they always wanted. I became someone they used to know. That's the thing about favoritism. It's like a disease that eats away at everything good until all that's left is resentment and a longing for something that will never be. I tried in my own quiet way to win their love back. I studied hard, tried to make them proud. But there was always something missing, something that made me feel like I was permanently on the outside looking in. I don't think they even realized what they were doing. Or maybe they did, and just didn't care. Either way, I got used to it, like a bad habit I couldn't shake. But lying there in that sterile room, it hit me harder than ever. The absence of my family felt like a stone pressing down on my chest. I wondered what it would take for them to truly see me. Would it require a miracle or a catastrophe? In a way, I was experiencing both. As the minutes dragged on, I found myself drifting in and out of consciousness, the sedatives pulling me under like a gentle tide. I thought I heard voices in the hallway, but it was just a nurse checking in, barely glancing at me before jotting something on her clipboard and slipping away like I was just another number. I could have called my parents, told them I was alone and needed them. But something inside me stopped me from reaching out. Why should I have to ask for the love and care that should be given freely? So I lay there waiting, not just for the surgery, but for some sign that I mattered. That sign never came. I remember the first time they brought her home. She looked so small and lost, clutching a worn-out teddy bear, like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. I watched from the stairs, peeking through the banisters, as my parents led her inside. They were all smiles, cooing over her, telling her how amazing everything was going to be. I felt a surge of hope, thinking maybe this would be good. Maybe having a sister would mean finally having someone on my side. I was wrong. It didn't take long for the dynamic to change. At first, they doted on her because she was new, fragile, needing extra attention. I understood that, at least at first. But as the months went by, it became clear she wasn't just an addition to our family. She was the main attraction. She had this knack for making everyone feel special, drawing them in with her charm and laughter. She didn't do it on purpose, I don't think. But it was like she had an invisible spotlight that followed her wherever she went, and I was left standing in the shadows. When I was younger, I was the center of their world, or at least it felt that way. My mom used to say I was the light of her life, that I made everything better just by being there. But once my sister arrived, all those sentiments faded. They didn't disappear completely. They just weren't directed at me anymore. It was like watching a movie where the lead character suddenly becomes a background extra, barely noticed, barely acknowledged. Sometimes I wondered if they even saw me. I tried to play along, to pretend it didn't bother me. I even helped my sister with her homework, taught her how to navigate the hallways at school, showed her all my secret hiding spots around the neighborhood. I wanted her to like me. I wanted my parents to see that I was still there, that I could be a good sister too. But no matter what I did, it was never enough. They'd look at her with this unbridled adoration, the kind I once thought was reserved for me, and I'd feel this ache in my chest, like a piece of myself was slowly being carved away. The years passed, and I became a pro at fading into the background. I threw myself into my studies, thinking maybe if I could just achieve something remarkable, they'd finally notice me again. I earned straight A's, won awards, and got into a prestigious college, but their enthusiasm was always lukewarm, at best. When my sister started excelling in school, though, it was like they'd discovered fire. Every grade, every accolade was celebrated as if she'd just won the Nobel Prize. They took her out to dinners, threw her parties, and filled the house with her trophies and certificates, a constant reminder of everything I wasn't. It wasn't that I hated her. In some ways, I even admired her. She had this natural ability to make everyone around her feel important, as if they were the only person in the room. It was a gift, one I didn't have. I was awkward, quiet, and introverted, qualities that didn't exactly draw people in. I'd accepted that, but it didn't make it any easier to watch my parents shower her with the love and attention I once took for granted. But what hurt the most was how they didn't even try to hide it. They'd talk about her in glowing terms right in front of me, as if I wasn't there. I can't count the number of times I overheard them praising her to their friends, talking about how proud they were, how she was going to make something of herself. I wanted to scream, to remind them that I was here too, that I'd accomplished things, that I was worth something. But I stayed silent, swallowing my pain and pretending it didn't matter. Now, lying in that hospital bed, I realized just how much it did matter. All those years of trying to earn their love, of hoping they'd see me as more than just a shadow, had led to this moment. I was alone, and they were with her, celebrating yet another one of her achievements. It felt like the universe was playing some cruel joke, showing me that no matter what I did, I'd always be second best. The decision to have the surgery wasn't one I took lightly. I'd put it off as long as I could, hoping maybe, just maybe, it wouldn't come to this. But the pain had become unbearable, and I was running out of options. When the doctors told me the procedure was risky but necessary, I nodded numbly, barely processing their words. The irony wasn't lost on me. The one time I was truly fighting for my life, I had no one fighting beside me. As they wheeled me into the operating room, I clung to a faint hope that my parents would be there when I woke up, that they'd understand how much I needed them. But deep down, I knew the truth. They'd promised to come. Of course, my mom had patted my hand, told me not to worry, that they'd be there as soon as they could. Yet I'd seen the look in her eyes, the hesitation, the slight edge of guilt. She hadn't even tried to hide it. The surgery had been scheduled for weeks, but the moment my sister's graduation fell on the same day, I knew where their priorities lay. I tried not to let it bother me, tried to tell myself it wasn't a big deal, that I could handle this on my own. But as I lay in that hospital bed, drifting in and out of consciousness, reality hit me like a punch to the gut. They weren't coming. I was alone. The nurse who came to check on me had a sympathetic smile, the kind you give someone who's just lost everything. She asked if there was anyone I wanted her to call, but I shook my head, unable to form the words. Who would I call anyway? I didn't have a long list of friends or a significant other waiting anxiously for updates. I'd always been the kind of person who kept to herself, never letting anyone get too close. I was my own support system, and right then, that felt like the loneliest thing in the world. The hours stretched on, each minute a reminder of the people who weren't there. I wanted to be angry, to lash out against the unfairness of it all, but instead I felt numb, a hollow ache filling the space where my heart should have been. I could picture them sitting in the auditorium, clapping and cheering as my sister walked across the stage. A picture-perfect family moment without me. I'd never felt more invisible. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the images that kept flashing through my mind, but they wouldn't go away. Every time I tried to push them down, they resurfaced, clawing their way back up with a vengeance. It was like my mind was determined to make me face the truth, to strip away the layers of denial I'd wrapped myself in over the years. They didn't care, not enough anyway. And that realization cut deeper than any scalpel ever could. I'd always been the dependable one, the one who did what was expected without complaint. I'd stayed out of trouble, got good grades, followed all the rules. And for what? So I could end up here, alone. While they celebrated someone else's success, I wondered what it would take to make them see me, to make them realize I was worth fighting for. But I already knew the answer. Nothing I did would ever be enough. When I finally drifted off to sleep, it was a restless, haunted kind of sleep, filled with half-formed dreams and shadowy figures. I dreamt of my sister standing on a stage, bathed in a golden light, while I stood in the wings, shrouded in darkness. No matter how hard I tried to reach her, she was always just out of reach, always basking in the glow that never seemed to touch me. I woke up gasping, the ache in my chest sharper than ever. It was then I knew things had to change. I couldn't keep living like this, couldn't keep pretending I was okay with being an afterthought. I'd spent too long waiting for them to come around, to see me, to love me the way I deserved. But that wasn't going to happen. And it was time I accepted that. I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life chasing after something that was never going to be mine. By the time the nurse came back in, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't sure what my next steps would be, but I knew one thing. I was done waiting. I was done hoping for a love that was never coming. I was going to find a way to matter, to myself if to no one else, and maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. The hospital room grew quieter as the days passed, the steady rhythm of machines my only constant. I'd thought my parents might show up eventually, even if just to save face, but there was nothing. Not a call, not a text, not even a bouquet of flowers left at the nurse's station with my name on it. The more I thought about it, the more I realized this was just another chapter in a long story I'd been living my whole life. They'd always put her first, and now I was finally feeling the full weight of what that meant. The nurses were kind, though. They tried to fill the silence with small talk, their voices gentle and patient, as if they knew just how fragile I was. One of them, a middle-aged woman with warm brown eyes, told me about her own family, how she had 3 kids and never enough time. She asked if I had siblings, and I found myself hesitating before mentioning my sister. I could hear the emptiness in my own words as I spoke. She smiled and said I was lucky, that sisters were a gift, but all I could do was nod and force a smile that didn't reach my eyes. I thought about reaching out to my sister, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. The truth was, I didn't know if I wanted her here. Part of me craved the support, the kind that comes from someone who knows you in a way only family can. But the other part, the part that had been bruised and battered by years of neglect, wanted nothing more than to push her away. After all, she'd never really been there for me either, had she? She was always too busy living in the glow of their approval to notice the shadows creeping over me. I spent hours just staring at the ceiling, the quiet giving me too much time to think. The memories came unbidden, each one sharper than the last. I remembered the time I'd won a writing contest in high school, a big deal in a place where nothing much happened. I'd come home, clutching my trophy, my heart swelling with pride. But when I walked through the door, they were celebrating my sister's new role as captain of the swim team. No one noticed the trophy in my hands, and I'd slipped away to my room, placing it on a dusty shelf that no one ever looked at. That was how it always was. I had my small victories, but they were always overshadowed by something brighter, something bigger. The longer I lay there, the more determined I became. I'd spent so many years trying to prove my worth to people who wouldn't see it. It was time to stop. I wasn't going to be the afterthought anymore. I didn't know what that meant yet or how I was going to make it happen, but I knew I couldn't keep waiting for their validation. I had to find a way to build something of my own, something that didn't depend on their approval. A week after the surgery, I finally gathered the strength to check my phone. I'd expected missed calls, maybe a few messages, but there was nothing. Not from my parents, not from my sister, just a few texts from old friends, the kind who reach out every few months, but aren't really part of your life. The silence was deafening. I thought I'd feel angry, but all I felt was empty. It was like standing on the edge of a cliff, looking out into a vast expanse of nothingness, realizing there was no one to pull you back. I dialed the only number I knew would answer. It was an old friend from high school, someone I'd lost touch with over the years, but who'd always been there when I needed him. He picked up on the third ring, his voice warm and familiar. We talked for hours, catching up on the years we'd missed. I told him about the surgery, about my parents, about the void I felt growing inside me. He listened without interrupting, letting me spill everything I'd been holding in. When I finally stopped, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said something I hadn't expected. Come stay with me. You need a break from them. You need a break from all of it. The idea was tempting, more tempting than I wanted to admit. I'd always been the dutiful daughter, the one who stayed close to home, who didn't stray too far from the life they'd mapped out for me. But suddenly, the thought of breaking free, of leaving it all behind, felt like the only thing keeping me afloat. I didn't hesitate. I told him I'd come. It took a few days to get everything in order, to convince the doctors to discharge me and to arrange for a ride. My friend picked me up from the hospital, his car a familiar haven that felt like home in a way I hadn't felt in years. As we drove away, I felt the weight begin to lift, piece by piece, as if I were shedding layers of a skin that no longer fit. I knew it wasn't going to be easy. I knew there were going to be nights when the loneliness would creep in, when I'd question everything. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was taking control of my life, like I was finally making a choice for me. As we cruised down the winding roads away from the city, I watched the landscape blur past, each mile taking me further from the people who'd never seen me. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't go back. Not to the life I'd known, not to the girl who was always waiting for someone else to decide her worth. I was done with that. Staying with Jake was a breath of fresh air, one I hadn't realized I needed so desperately. His apartment was small and cluttered, filled with books, records, and random memorabilia he'd collected over the years. It was chaotic but cozy, a stark contrast to the pristine, sterile atmosphere I'd grown up in. My parents' house had always been immaculate, a shrine to order and appearances, but it never felt like a home. Here, though, I could breathe. I could finally let my guard down. In those first few days, we barely spoke about what had happened. He seemed to understand that I needed time, and I was grateful for his patience. We spent our time watching old movies, ordering takeout, and talking about everything except the things that weighed most heavily on my heart. He didn't press me for details, and I didn't volunteer them. There was an unspoken agreement between us, a quiet understanding that I needed this space to rebuild myself. But the memories wouldn't leave me alone. They crept in at night, haunting me in the dark, each one a reminder of the life I'd left behind. I kept replaying the last conversation I'd had with my mom before the surgery. I'd called her, hoping to hear some semblance of concern in her voice, but all I got was the same polite indifference she'd always shown me. She'd asked about the surgery in a detached way, as if she were talking about the weather. There was no worry, no urgency. When I mentioned that I was scared, she brushed it off, saying I'd be fine, that I was always fine. That night, I finally broke down. Jake found me sitting on the bathroom floor, my knees drawn to my chest, sobbing in a way I hadn't allowed myself to in years. He didn't say anything, just sat beside me, letting me cry until I had nothing left. It felt like I was purging years of pain, all the hurt and disappointment I'd tried so hard to bury. For once, I wasn't trying to hold it all together. I wasn't pretending to be okay. I was just me, broken, angry, and desperately trying to piece myself back together. Over the next few weeks, I started to settle into a new routine. I got a job at a local bookstore, something simple that gave me a reason to get out of bed each day. The work was easy, almost meditative, and I found comfort in the rows of books, the smell of paper and ink, the quiet that surrounded me. It was a small place, mostly frequented by regulars, and I quickly grew to know them all. There was something grounding about being part of this world, a world where people noticed me, even if only in passing. But even as I began to build this new life, the shadow of my family hung over me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was running away, that I'd abandoned them as they had abandoned me. I knew I was better off without them, but the guilt lingered, gnawing at the edges of my newfound peace. I wondered if they'd even noticed I was gone. Part of me wanted to call them, to tell them where I was, to see if they'd ask me to come home. But I knew better than to expect that kind of concern. One afternoon, I was shelving books when my phone buzzed. It was a text from Riley. She hadn't reached out since before the surgery, and seeing her name on my screen sent a jolt of anger through me. The message was brief, just a few lines asking how I was, as if she didn't already know what I'd been through. I debated ignoring it, letting her wonder, but a surge of curiosity got the best of me. I responded, telling her I was fine, that I was staying with a friend, and that I was done with the family for now. Her reply came almost instantly. She asked if I'd come back for a visit, if we could talk. I could sense the urgency in her words, the need to smooth things over, to bring me back into the fold. But I wasn't ready for that. I wasn't ready to face her, to pretend that everything was fine when it wasn't. I told her I needed space, that I'd reach out when I was ready. I could feel the frustration in her response, a string of hurried words about how much she missed me, how things weren't the same without me. It felt hollow, a desperate attempt to keep me tethered to a life I no longer belonged to. As the days passed, the texts from Riley became less frequent, until eventually they stopped altogether. I felt a strange sense of relief, as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I knew she'd go back to her life, the life our parents had so carefully crafted for her, and I was okay with that. I was building something new for myself, something that didn't revolve around them, and for the first time, I felt free. But freedom came with a price. I was alone in this, navigating a world I barely understood, trying to find my place without the safety net I'd always counted on. There were nights when the loneliness felt unbearable, when I wondered if I'd made a mistake. But each morning, I'd get up, go to work, and remind myself that this was my choice. I was no longer an afterthought, no longer a shadow. I was becoming someone new, someone who didn't need their validation. One night, as I closed up the bookstore, a familiar face walked through the door. It was Mia, an old friend from school who I hadn't seen in years. We'd been close once, bonded by a mutual love of books and late-night conversations about life and all its messy complications. Seeing her again felt like stumbling upon a piece of my old life, a reminder of who I used to be before everything fell apart. She greeted me with a warm hug, the kind that wraps around you like a blanket on a cold day. We slipped into an easy conversation, as if no time had passed, catching up on all the things that had changed since we'd last seen each other. She'd moved back to town recently, following a failed relationship, and the kind of heartbreak that left her reeling. I could see the pain lingering in her eyes, a mirror of my own struggles, and it felt strangely comforting to know I wasn't alone in feeling lost. Mia and I started meeting regularly after that. We'd sit in her tiny apartment, sipping tea and sharing stories about the paths that had led us to this point. She talked about her ex with a bitter smile, recounting the broken promises and lies that had shattered her trust. I told her about my parents, about the surgery, about the way they'd left me alone when I needed it the most. She listened without judgment, her gaze steady and understanding, as if she could see right through to the heart of me. One evening, after we'd spent hours dissecting our respective traumas, Mia suggested we do something impulsive. She'd always been the adventurous type, the one who could coax me out of my shell with a single, mischievous grin. She proposed a road trip, just the two of us, a chance to escape from the weight of our pasts and explore something new. The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating, a jolt of excitement that reminded me of the girl I used to be. I agreed, and within a week, we were packed and ready to go. We didn't have a destination in mind, just a map and a vague sense of direction. We drove for hours, windows down, music blasting, the wind whipping through our hair as we laughed and sang along to old songs. It felt like freedom, the kind of reckless abandon I'd only ever dreamed of. With Mia by my side, I wasn't the careful, measured person I'd always been. I was alive, caught up in the thrill of the unknown, unburdened by the expectations that had always weighed me down. We stopped in small towns along the way, exploring dusty bookstores and quaint cafes, collecting memories like souvenirs. Mia had a way of making everything feel like an adventure, and I found myself falling into her rhythm, letting go of the need to control every detail. She'd pull me onto dance floors in empty bars, convincing me to twirl and sway to music I didn't know, our laughter echoing in the empty spaces. For the first time in years, I felt like I was living instead of just existing. But even in the midst of this newfound joy, there was a part of me that couldn't completely forget. Late at night, when Mia had drifted off to sleep, I'd lie awake, my thoughts drifting back to my family. I wondered if they missed me, if they even noticed I was gone. I'd check my phone, half expecting a message that never came, a reminder that I was still tethered to them, even from miles away. It was a strange dichotomy, the pull between the life I was building and the one I'd left behind. During one of those sleepless nights, I found myself scrolling through social media, a habit I'd mostly abandoned since leaving home. I came across a post from Riley, a carefully curated image of her with our parents, smiling and happy. They looked like a perfect family, untouched by the mess I'd left behind, as if my absence had barely caused a ripple. The sight of it made my stomach twist, a reminder of the life they'd chosen without me. The next morning, Mia noticed the change in my mood. She was perceptive that way, always able to see through my attempts to hide what I was feeling. She asked if I wanted to talk about it, but I shook my head, unwilling to let those old wounds ruin the adventure we'd created. Instead, I plastered on a smile and pretended I was fine, even as the weight of that image lingered, heavy and suffocating. As we continued our journey, I tried to focus on the present, to savor each moment with Mia, but the cracks were beginning to show. I felt torn between the freedom I'd found and the family I'd left behind, caught in a limbo that felt impossible to escape. Mia sensed it too. And one evening, as we watched the sun set over a quiet stretch of beach, she turned to me with a serious expression. You're allowed to miss them, she said, her voice soft but firm. You're allowed to feel conflicted. It doesn't make you weak. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, a reminder that I didn't have to pretend to be okay. She was right. I was allowed to feel, to mourn the family I'd never really had. I didn't have to keep pushing it down, pretending it didn't matter. I could grieve for the loss, even if it was one I'd chosen. That night, I let myself cry again, this time not out of anger or frustration, but out of acceptance. I cried for the life I'd never have, for the love I'd never receive from the people who should have given it freely. Mia held me as I broke down, her presence a balm to the ache I'd carried for so long. It felt like a release, a letting go of something I'd clung to for too long. I knew I wasn't done grieving, but in that moment, I felt lighter, as if I'd shed a piece of the burden I'd been carrying. After our road trip, Mia and I settled back into a routine, each of us returning to the lives we'd been trying to escape. I went back to the bookstore, falling into the familiar rhythm of quiet days and the comfort of shelves lined with stories. But something had shifted inside me. The time on the road had been a temporary reprieve, but now that I was back, I felt the old tensions creeping in, the unresolved emotions clawing at me. One afternoon, just as I was closing up, my phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. I hesitated, debating whether or not to answer. Something in me knew this wasn't a random call. I picked up, and Riley's voice came through, strained and quiet. She told me that our mom had been in an accident. Her words came out in a rush, but they didn't quite sink in. It felt distant, surreal, as if she were talking about someone else's life. Without thinking, I found myself saying I'd come back. The words slipped out before I even considered them, an automatic response, the kind born of years of conditioning. After I hung up, I sat there, the weight of my decision settling over me, like a cold blanket. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to pretend I hadn't answered, but I knew I couldn't. Despite everything, the thought of my mom in a hospital bed, vulnerable and alone, struck a chord I couldn't ignore. Mia noticed my distraction as soon as I got home. She asked if I was okay, and for once, I didn't try to hide the truth. I was okay, I said, but I got a call from Riley. Mom's in the hospital. I told her about the call, about my decision to go back, even though it felt like a betrayal of everything I'd been building. She didn't judge me, just nodded and offered to drive me to the hospital. Her understanding was a balm, a reminder that I didn't have to face this alone. The drive back felt like a return to a past I'd tried to leave behind. As we approached the city, memories started flooding in, each one more vivid than the last. I thought of all the times I'd sat in the backseat with my parents, watching the world go by as they talked about Riley's latest achievements, barely noticing I was there. The closer we got, the more my resolve wavered, but Mia's presence beside me kept me grounded. When we arrived at the hospital, Riley was waiting in the lobby. She looked exhausted, her face drawn and pale, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of sympathy. She hugged me, a quick, perfunctory gesture, and then we made our way to our mom's room. My dad was already there, sitting by her bedside, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He barely acknowledged me, his focus entirely on my mom, who lay motionless, her face obscured by tubes and wires. The sight of her hit me harder than I'd expected. She looked so small, so fragile, a stark contrast to the woman who'd always seemed so put together, so untouchable. I felt a mix of emotions: anger, pity, sadness, all swirling together in a confusing blur. I wanted to reach out, to touch her hand, but something held me back. Instead, I stood there, frozen, watching as my family played out a scene I'd always been on the periphery of. Riley turned to me, her eyes filled with a desperation I hadn't seen before. She asked if I'd stay, if I'd help them through this. The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. I knew what she was asking, and I knew why. They needed me now, needed the stability I'd always provided, the quiet presence they'd taken for granted. But I also knew that as soon as the crisis passed, I'd fade into the background once again. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on me. I could see the expectation in her eyes, the silent plea for me to step back into the role I'd always played, but something inside me resisted. I couldn't go back to being the afterthought, the one who was always there, waiting for a love that would never come. Not anymore. I told them I'd stay, but only for a few days. I wasn't committing to anything beyond that, and I made it clear that this wasn't about mending broken bridges. This was about doing what I could live with, about offering what little I had left to give. They didn't protest, and I took that as a sign they understood, even if they didn't like it. The next few days passed in a blur of hospital rooms and whispered conversations. I watched my family from a distance, taking in the way they interacted, the unspoken dynamics that had always defined us. My dad stoic and silent, sitting by my mom's side as if his presence alone could will her back to health. Riley, flitting between hope and despair, clinging to the belief that everything would be okay. And me, caught in the middle, trying to find my place in a family I'd always felt disconnected from. There were moments when I felt the old pull, the familiar urge to slip back into my role, to be the dutiful daughter they expected. But I held back, keeping my distance, protecting the fragile sense of self I'd worked so hard to build. I knew that as soon as I let them in, I'd be swallowed whole, lost in the shadows once more. On the last day, as I prepared to leave, my dad approached me. He looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in years. There was something in his eyes, a flicker of regret, maybe even remorse. He didn't say anything, just nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the choices I'd made. I felt a strange sense of closure, a quiet acceptance that things would never be what I'd wanted them to be, but that it was okay. I could walk away now, knowing I'd done what I could. And that was enough. Leaving the hospital felt like shedding a heavy cloak, one I'd worn for so long that I'd forgotten what it was like to be without it. Mia drove me home in silence, respecting the unspoken need I had to process everything. The city lights blurred past, and I watched them with a strange sense of detachment, as if I were floating above it all, untethered and weightless. I had done what I came to do. I'd offered my family a sliver of what they'd never given me, and now I was free to return to the life I'd started to build for myself. The days that followed were filled with a strange sense of peace, mingled with a bittersweet sadness I couldn't quite shake. I went back to the bookstore, slipping back into the routine that had become my anchor. The familiar faces of the regulars, the quiet murmur of conversation, the scent of old books, all of it wrapped around me like a balm. But there was an edge to everything now, a heightened awareness that things had shifted irrevocably. Mia, always perceptive, seemed to sense my inner turmoil. She didn't press me for details, but one evening, as we sat together over a shared bottle of wine, she turned to me with that piercing gaze of hers. "You know, it's okay to feel conflicted," she said. "You don't have to have it all figured out right now." Her words hung in the air, a gentle reminder that healing wasn't a linear process. I'd spent so much of my life trying to categorize my emotions, to box them up neatly and tuck them away. But this was different. I was wading through a sea of uncertainty, navigating feelings I hadn't allowed myself to acknowledge before. It was exhausting, but there was also a sense of liberation in it, like I was finally giving myself permission to feel without judgment. I thought back to the last conversation I'd had with my dad. His silence, his nod, The way he looked at me, it was all so unlike him, a man who'd always been stoic and impenetrable. I replayed that moment over and over in my mind, searching for clues, for some hidden meaning I might have missed. But there was nothing, just a quiet acknowledgement that felt like both a beginning and an end. Riley texted me a few times, asking how I was and if I'd made it home safely. Her messages were polite, almost formal, as if we were acquaintances rather than family. I responded with the same detached civility, not wanting to give more than I could afford to lose. I'd drawn my boundaries, and for once, I intended to stick to them. I was done bending myself into shapes that fit their expectations, done sacrificing pieces of myself in the hopes of earning a love that had always been conditional. One evening, as I was closing up the bookstore, an older woman lingered at the counter, thumbing through a stack of books with a wistful expression. She reminded me of my mom, the way she used to stand in the library, lost in thought, always searching for something just out of reach. I felt a pang of nostalgia, but I shook it off, reminding myself that I was here now, in this new life I was building, and that the past didn't have to dictate my future. The woman struck up a conversation, telling me about her favorite authors, the books that had shaped her life. She had a warmth about her, a kindness that reminded me of the things I'd always craved but rarely found. She spoke with a quiet confidence, her words weaving a tapestry of stories that felt both foreign and familiar. As we talked, I found myself opening up, sharing pieces of myself that I'd kept hidden for so long. It was strange, confiding in a stranger, but there was a comfort in it, a reminder that connection didn't always have to come from the places we expected. After she left, I sat behind the counter, replaying our conversation in my mind. It was a small moment, insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but it felt like a shift, a tiny ripple that hinted at the possibility of something new. I realized then that I didn't have to cling to the idea of family as the only source of belonging. I could find connection in unexpected places, in fleeting conversations and chance encounters, in the quiet moments that filled the spaces between the chaos. The weeks passed, and I settled deeper into this new life. Each day a step further from the shadows that had once consumed me. I found joy in the little things, in the way the sunlight streamed through the bookstore windows, in the laughter that bubbled up when Mia and I shared our inside jokes, in the quiet contentment of a life that felt for the first time like my own. But the memories still lingered, surfacing at odd moments, catching me off guard. I'd see a family walking down the street or hear a familiar song on the radio, and the ache would return, a reminder of the things I'd lost and the things I'd never had. It wasn't a sharp pain anymore, but a dull, persistent throb, like an old wound that had never fully healed. One evening, as I lay in bed, I found myself thinking about Riley again. I wondered if she'd ever truly understood the role she'd played in my life, if she'd ever felt the weight of the expectations that had been thrown on her shoulders. In a way, I knew she'd been as much a victim of our parents' favoritism as I had, molded into their ideal without a say in the matter. I felt a strange sense of empathy for her, a recognition that we'd both been caught in the same web, even if we'd been on opposite sides. For the first time, I considered reaching out, not to reconcile or rebuild the relationship, but simply to acknowledge the shared history that bound us. I wasn't sure if I was ready to forgive, or if I even wanted to, but there was a part of me that longed for closure, for a way to lay the past to rest. I didn't know what that would look like, or if it was even possible, but the thought lingered. A seed planted in the back of my mind, waiting to take root. A few days later, I decided to send Riley a message. It was short and simple, just a suggestion to meet up and talk. I wasn't entirely sure what I wanted to say, or if I was even ready for the conversation, but the need for closure outweighed my doubts. I was tired of carrying the burden of unresolved feelings, tired of wondering if there was something left to salvage. Her response came quickly, a brief but eager acceptance. We agreed to meet at a quiet cafe near the bookstore, a neutral ground that felt safe. I arrived early, nerves prickling beneath my skin as I settled into a corner booth, watching the door for any sign of her. When she finally walked in, I was struck by how familiar yet different she looked. She carried herself with the same confidence, the same effortless grace, but there was a weariness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. We exchanged tentative smiles as she sat down, the silence between us thick and uncomfortable. I could feel the weight of all the things left unsaid pressing down on us, an invisible wall that neither of us knew how to breach. I wasn't sure if I could trust this newfound openness, or if it was just another attempt to smooth over the cracks in our fractured relationship. I've missed you too, I replied, my voice barely more than a whisper. It was true, in a way. I had missed her, or at least the version of her I'd once believed in, but I wasn't sure if that person existed anymore, or if she ever had. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the conversation I knew we needed to have. I want to talk about everything, I began, choosing my words carefully. About us, about our family. I don't want to pretend that things were fine when they weren't. She nodded, her expression thoughtful, and for a moment I saw a flicker of understanding in her eyes. It was a look I'd seen countless times before, but this time, it felt different, more genuine. She didn't rush to defend our parents or brush aside my feelings, as she had in the past. Instead, she leaned forward, her hands clasped together on the table, her gaze fixed on me. I know things weren't perfect, she said, her voice steady but tinged with regret. I know I didn't always see what you were going through. I was so focused on keeping them happy, on being what they wanted me to be, that I didn't realize how much it was costing you. Her words hung between us, a confession that felt both overdue and unexpected. I felt a surge of anger and sadness, a cocktail of emotions I'd spent years trying to suppress. But beneath it all, there was a glimmer of something else, a fragile, tentative hope that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to move forward. I resented you for so long, I admitted, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. I felt like I was always in your shadow, always fighting for scraps of their attention. I know it wasn't your fault, but it was easier to blame you than to admit that they'd chosen you over me. She flinched but didn't look away. I could see the pain in her eyes, a reflection of my own, and for the first time, I realized how much we'd both been hurt by the same forces. We'd been pitted against each other, cast in roles we hadn't chosen, and it had left us both scarred. I never wanted that, she said, her voice trembling. I never wanted to take anything from you. I thought if I could be perfect, maybe they'd love me enough for both of us. Her words struck a chord deep within me, a truth I'd never considered. I'd always seen her as the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. But I'd never stopped to think about what it had cost her. She had been trapped too, caught in a cycle of trying to meet their impossible standards, just as I had. We were both victims of the same misguided love, shaped by the same unmet expectations. For a moment, we sat in silence, absorbing the weight of our shared pain. It was as if a dam had broken, releasing years of pent-up emotions that neither of us had been able to express. I felt a strange sense of relief, mingled with a lingering sadness for all the time we'd lost. I don't know if we can fix this, I said finally, my voice barely more than a whisper. But I want to try. I want to find a way to be sisters, without all the baggage. She nodded, a small, tentative smile crossing her lips. Me too. I don't want to keep pretending everything's fine. I want to be real with you, even if it's hard. We spent the rest of the afternoon talking, sharing stories and memories, piecing together fragments of a relationship that had been fractured for so long. It wasn't perfect, and it certainly wasn't easy, but it felt like a start. For the first time, we were both trying, both willing to face the mess we'd been born into and find a way through it together. As we parted ways, I felt a strange sense of hope, fragile but real. I knew we had a long road ahead, that healing wouldn't come overnight, but I was willing to take it one step at a time. I'd spent too many years running from the past, but now I was ready to face it head on, to let go of the anger and resentment that had held me back. I walked away from that cafe with a lighter heart, a renewed sense of purpose. I didn't know what the future held or if our tentative peace would last, but I was willing to find out. I was ready to build something new, something real. And this time, I wasn't going to let fear or doubt hold me back. In the weeks following our conversation, I found myself thinking about Riley more often. It wasn't the bitter, resentful kind of thoughts that had plagued me before. Instead, it was a quiet curiosity, a tentative hope that maybe we could find some way to redefine what we meant to each other. The old wounds were still there, of course, but they felt less raw, as if talking to her had pulled out a thorn that had been festering for years. We started meeting up occasionally, usually for coffee or a walk in the park. The conversations were slow at first, like two strangers learning each other's rhythms. We didn't dive into the heavy stuff right away. Instead, we talked about our jobs, our daily routines, the mundane details of our lives that we'd never shared before. It was strange, discovering all these things about someone I thought I knew so well, but I found that I enjoyed it. It was like building a new friendship, one based not on forced proximity, but on a genuine desire to connect. Mia noticed the change in me. She'd seen me at my lowest, had held me together when I was falling apart, and now she watched as I began to piece myself back together. One evening, as we sat in her apartment, she asked me if I was happy. The question caught me off guard, and I took a moment to consider it. Happiness had always seemed like a distant concept, something other people experienced while I stood on the sidelines. But now, for the first time, I felt a spark of it, a small, steady flame that warmed me from the inside out. I think I'm getting there, I replied, a smile tugging at the corners of my lips. It was an honest answer, one that surprised even me. I wasn't fully healed, not by a long shot, but I was on the right path, and that was enough. Mia grinned, wrapping me in one of her tight, comforting hugs. "I'm proud of you," she whispered, and the sincerity in her voice brought tears to my eyes. As the weeks turned into months, I began to carve out a life that felt truly mine. The bookstore became more than just a job. It was a sanctuary, a place where I felt grounded and at peace. I made new friends, people who saw me for who I was and didn't expect anything more. I still met up with Riley, our relationship growing bit by bit, like a garden that had been neglected but was slowly being tended back to life. There were setbacks, of course, moments when the old resentments flared up, but we were learning how to navigate them, to let go of the need to be right, and instead focus on understanding each other. One afternoon, as I was rearranging a shelf of poetry books, my phone buzzed with a message from Riley. She wanted to invite me over for dinner, a small family gathering to celebrate our mom's recovery. The thought of going back to that house, of stepping into the place that held so many painful memories, sent a shiver down my spine. But I knew this was part of the process, part of the healing I'd committed to. I texted her back with a simple, "I'll be there." The day of the dinner, Mia offered to drive me, sensing my hesitation. I was grateful for her support, as always, but I knew I had to face this on my own. As I walked up to the front door, memories flooded back, each one a sharp reminder of the girl I'd once been. But I took a deep breath, steadying myself, and knocked. My mom opened the door, her face lighting up in a way I hadn't seen in years. She pulled me into a hug, and I allowed myself to sink into it, to feel the warmth and familiarity that had once been a source of comfort. It was awkward at first, navigating the small talk and polite exchanges, but I found myself easing into it, letting go of the tension I'd carried in with me. Dinner was a quiet affair, just my parents, Riley, and me. We talked about everyday things, the kind of mundane conversations I'd once found suffocating, but now felt oddly comforting. There was a sense of normalcy that I hadn't expected, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to coexist without the weight of the past hanging over us. After dinner, Riley and I stepped outside to take a walk around the garden. The air was cool, filled with the scent of freshly cut grass, and the faint aroma of my mom's flowers. We walked in silence for a while, each of us lost in our own thoughts, until she finally spoke. "I know things will never be perfect between us," she said, her voice soft but steady, "but I want you to know that I'm trying. I want us to be a real family, not just people who share the same roof." Her words resonated with me, a reminder that we were both working towards the same goal, even if the path was rocky. I reached for her hand, a small gesture of solidarity, and she squeezed it in return. It was a simple moment, but it felt monumental, a step towards the future we were both trying to build. As I drove home that night, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't known before. I realized that forgiveness wasn't a single act, but a process, one that required patience and perseverance. I wasn't fully there yet, but I was closer than I'd ever been, and that was enough. I knew there would still be days when the past felt too close, when the old wounds would ache and the shadows would creep in. But I also knew that I had the strength to face them, that I'd built a life filled with people who supported me, who saw me for who I was and loved me anyway. And so, as I looked out over the city lights, I felt a quiet satisfaction settle over me. I had faced the ghosts of my past, confronted the pain and the loss, and come out the other side stronger. I was no longer the girl waiting in the wings, hoping to be noticed. I was carving out my own place, one step at a time, building a life that was wholly and undeniably mine. With a final glance back at the world I'd left behind, I took a deep breath and stepped forward, ready to embrace whatever the future held. For the first time, I felt truly free,